All right. Welcome back, everyone, for another deep dive.
Yes.
And today we're tackling a pretty sensitive topic. We're going to be looking at the war in Ukraine, but through a very specific lens.
Yeah.
And that lens is the question of whether or not this war could have ended sooner.
Right.
And we're going to be looking at the evidence for that and against that.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to be basing a lot of our deep dive on the peace negotiations that happened in Istanbul in early 2022.
Right. So, yeah, this is really fascinating to consider. I mean, especially in those early days, March, April 2022, it's just weeks into the invasion. And it was pretty remarkable that Ukrainian and Russian officials were actually sitting down face to face trying to hash out a peace treaty.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to imagine now.
Right.
Given how entrenched both sides have become.
Totally. And they weren't just talking. I mean, there was actual progress happening. They were developing a framework for a potential peace treaty. There was even a meeting planned between Zelensky and Putin scheduled for April 9th. Okay.
And there was even a possibility of a ceasefire coming out of that.
So the question is, what happened? I mean, a lot of people point to Bucha and the atrocities that were uncovered there as the reason why those talks fell apart.
Of course.
But is that the whole story?
Yeah, that's what we're looking into. Bucha definitely had a huge impact. I mean, that's undeniable. But there are some sources that suggest that other factors may have been at play, too.
Okay.
And some even go as far as suggesting that the U.S. and its Western allies might have actually had a hand in preventing the war from ending sooner than it could have.
Okay, hold on a second. So are you saying that there are people out there who are blaming the U.S. for the war dragging on?
There are.
That's a pretty serious accusation. I mean, what kind of evidence do we have to support that? Yeah, it is a serious accusation. Well, there are a number of testimonies and reports from people who were involved in those very sensitive negotiations. Perhaps we can start with the Turkish perspective. So Turkey, they were hosting the talks, so they had a front row seat, so to speak, to everything that was happening. And Mevlut Cavusoglu, who was Turkey's foreign minister at the time, has actually publicly stated that some NATO countries, he didn't name any specifically, but he did say that certain NATO members wanted the war to continue in order to weaken Russia.
Interesting. So the implication here is that some countries saw this as an opportunity to kind of, diminish Russia's power and, weaken them on the world stage.
I think that's a possible interpretation.
Yeah.
And, it's not just Cavusoglu who thinks this way. Another Turkish official, Numan Kurtulmuş, who is the deputy chairman of Erdogan's party, he has also made similar statements suggesting that there was someone trying to sabotage the peace talks, basically prevent them from reaching a successful conclusion.
Wow.
So we've got two high-level Turkish officials who are saying that certain NATO countries, unnamed, were not interested in a quick peace.
Okay, so is there anyone else who corroborates this view? I mean, we've got these two Turkish officials.
Right.
But are there other voices that support this?
Yeah. Well, Naftali Bennett, who was the Israeli prime minister at the time and who served as a mediator between Russia and Ukraine during those very tense early months of the war, he has also stated that the U.S. blocked the peace talks.
Okay, that's a pretty direct statement.
It is.
I mean, he's not mincing his words there.
Right. And he's not alone in that assessment. Gerhard Schroeder, the former German chancellor, who, has close ties to Russia and also participated in those mediation efforts, has echoed Bennett's statement, saying that the really important decisions were being made in Washington, not Kyiv.
Okay, so we have this narrative emerging that the U.S. was actively trying to, I guess you could say, undermine the negotiations. But shouldn't we also consider whether or not Russia was genuinely committed to peace?
We should.
I mean, can we just focus on the U.S. and ignore the other side of the equation?
Of course not. And, that's why we really need to analyze Russia's actions and motivations during those talks. Were they really looking for a way out? Were they really looking for a peaceful solution? Or were they, just using the negotiations as a way to regroup their forces and solidify their control over those territories they had already captured?
It's an important question. But before we get into that, I think we should also hear the Ukrainian side of the story.
Yeah.
Because, it's easy to get caught up in this debate about the U.S. and Russia.
Yeah.
But let's not forget that it was Ukraine that was being invaded.
Right.
So what was happening within Ukraine during this time? Were there groups within Ukraine that were pushing for peace even after Bucha happened?
Well, to answer that, I think we need to look at the statements from some of the key figures in Ukraine. David Urakamia, who was Ukraine's chief negotiator, has said that Boris Johnson, who was the UK prime minister at the time, advised Zelensky against signing any agreements with Russia.
Interesting.
So even amongst Ukraine's closest allies, there were different opinions on how to proceed.
Right.
And Urakamia also revealed that several Western powers, he didn't name any specifically, but it's assumed he was referring to the U.S. and other countries, discouraged Ukraine from pursuing what they called ephemeral security guarantees, which was a central part of the peace deal that was being negotiated.
So just to recap, we've got Urakamia, who was in charge of the negotiations for Ukraine, saying that there was pressure from the West, pressure from the UK specifically to keep fighting.
Exactly.
But what about Zelensky himself?
Yeah.
I mean, he was initially pretty open to negotiating with Putin.
Yeah.
Even after Bucha, wasn't he?
He was. He expressed horror, understandably, at what had happened and acknowledged how difficult it would be to negotiate with a regime capable of those kinds of acts. Mm-hmm. But, you know, he did see the need for dialogue. Yeah. He didn't say that that option was off the table.
So it seems like there was still this window for diplomacy.
Yeah.
Even after Bucha. And you know what's interesting is that a lot of people think that the talks ended abruptly after Bucha.
Yeah.
But there's evidence that suggests they actually continued and in some ways even intensified.
Yeah, for weeks afterwards. There were talks going on.
For weeks after Bucha.
Yeah.
Okay, so if it wasn't just Bucha, then what else was happening?
Yeah, that's a great question.
What were the factors that ultimately led to those talks breaking down?
Well, this is where I think the testimonies of diplomats and officials who were directly involved in those talks become really crucial. Samuel Cherep and Sergei Radchenko, who are very well-respected experts on international relations, have written extensively about those negotiations. Right. And they've argued that there were other forces at work trying to derail the peace process.
So we have this idea emerging that there was someone deliberately trying to sabotage the talks, but who are we talking about here?
That's what we need to figure out.
Yeah.
One name that keeps coming up is Victoria Nuland.
Right.
She was the former U.S. Undersecretary of State, and she's hinted at active U.S. involvement in scuttling the Istanbul negotiations.
Wow. Okay, this is serious stuff.
Yeah.
So what has Nuland said about the U.S. role?
Well, she's confirmed reports that U.S. officials were really concerned about the terms that Ukraine and Russia were agreeing to during those Istanbul talks. Yeah. They were even worried that Ukraine didn't fully grasp what they might be signing.
Interesting.
So the U.S. might have been more interventionist than we realized.
Okay.
And we also have some more recent testimony that really adds another layer to this. Jean-Daniel Rouch, who was the Swiss ambassador to Turkey during the talks, had access to all the key players and was involved in those consultations about potential neutrality for Ukraine.
Okay.
So he agrees with the assessments that have been put forward by others that the West, and particularly the U.S. and Great Britain, pulled the plug on a negotiation that was actually on the verge of achieving a ceasefire.
Okay, so this is a lot to take in.
Yeah.
I mean, we've got Turkish officials, we've got former prime ministers, we've got diplomats, we've got experts, and they're all saying that, you know, there was this external pressure, particularly from the U.S., that played a role in derailing these peace talks.
It seems that way.
And we haven't even gotten to the Russian perspective yet.
We haven't.
Which is, you know, a whole other layer.
A whole other side to
this story.
Absolutely.
So this is definitely something we need to unpack further.
For sure. And maybe the most important thing is that we need to consider what all of this means ethically. Right. I mean, if there was a real chance for peace, even a fragile one, and it was deliberately undermined, then we have to ask some very difficult questions.
Right.
Questions about the true cost of this war, not just in terms of lives lost, but in terms of missed opportunities.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
And this is where I think the concept of a just war comes into play. It's not just about having a reason to go to war,
right?
But it's also about making sure that war is the very last resort.
Okay, let's unpack that a bit.
Yeah.
I mean, I know we hear that term a lot, just war.
Yeah.
But what does it actually mean in this context?
Well, just war theory has been around for centuries, going back to people like Augustine and Aquinas.
Yeah.
And it's really about setting ethical limits on when and how war can be used.
Right.
And one of the core principles of just war theory is that war should only be waged after all other peaceful options have been exhausted.
Okay, so the question is, in the case of Ukraine, were all peaceful options truly exhausted?
That's the million-dollar question, and that's what we're asking you to consider here.
Right.
We've presented you with a lot of different perspectives. Right.
Some support the idea that the U.S. played a role in prolonging the war, and some offer different explanations.
Yeah.
But it's up to you to weigh that evidence and come to your own conclusions.
Exactly. We're not here to give you the answers, but to give you the information.
The tool.
Yeah, the tools to navigate this really complex and often tragic situation.
So as we continue this deep dive, keep this question in mind.
Yeah.
Was continuing this war truly the last resort?
Yeah.
And if not, what were the implications of that choice?
It's a good question to keep in mind.
Yeah.
And in the next part, we're going to be taking a closer look at the Russian perspective.
Okay.
And kind of examining what their motives were and what their actions tell us.
Sounds good.
About their commitment to peace. So stay tuned for that.
All right.
We'll be right back after the break.
See you soon.
So where do we go from here?
Well, I think it's time to turn our attention to Russia.
Okay.
Because, we were talking earlier about whether or not they were genuinely committed to peace in those early negotiations, or if they were just playing for time.
Absolutely. And that's a really crucial point because, it's easy to get caught up in the whole debate about the U.S.'s role.
Right.
But we can't forget that it was Russia that invaded Ukraine.
Exactly.
They were the aggressor. So looking at their actions during those talks is, I think, really important if we want to understand what their real intentions were.
All right. So what do their actions tell us?
Well, some argue that Putin never really wanted peace.
Okay.
That he was just using the negotiations as a way to buy time to regroup his forces and really consolidate his hold on the territory he had already taken.
Okay, that's a pretty cynical view, but, is there any evidence to support that?
Well, there's the fact that Russia continued its military offensive even while the talks were happening.
Right.
It's not exactly a sign of good faith to be, bombing cities and negotiating at the same time.
That's true. Actions speak louder than words. And it's worth pointing out that Russia has a history of using negotiations as a way to kind of advance their own interests.
Right.
Rather than genuinely trying to find a peaceful resolution.
Yeah, I mean, look at the Minsk agreements.
Right.
Which were supposed to end the fighting in eastern Ukraine back in 2014.
Exactly.
They signed those agreements, but they never really upheld their end of the bargain.
So, based on Russia's past behavior and their actions in those early months of the war, it's fair to question whether or not they were actually committed to peace.
Yeah, it's definitely a question worth asking. But even if we acknowledge that, Russia might not have been negotiating in good faith, it doesn't completely let the U.S. and its allies off the hook.
Okay, I'm following you. So you're saying that even if Russia was acting in bad faith, there's still an argument to be made that the U.S. could have done more to pursue a diplomatic solution.
I think so. I mean, think about it this way. If you knew that someone was prone to lying and cheating, wouldn't you be even more careful in your dealings with them? Wouldn't you try to explore every possible avenue to avoid a confrontation?
Especially if the stakes were really high.
Especially if the stakes were high, like, life or death.
Right. It's like those hostage negotiation movies where they say, never negotiate with terrorists.
Right.
But then they always end up negotiating.
They always do.
Because the alternative is just too horrible.
Yeah. And in this case, the stakes were incredibly high.
Exactly.
So even if we assume that Russia wasn't being totally honest, it still raises questions about whether the U.S. did everything it could to really exhaust those peaceful options.
Okay. So we're not just talking about who's to blame here.
No.
But we're talking about the choices that were made and the potential consequences.
Exactly. Right. And that brings us back to the idea of a just war.
And that principle of last resort was continuing this war.
Right.
Really the only option.
Was it the last resort?
Was it the last resort, or was there something else that could have been done to prevent all this suffering?
These are tough questions.
They are.
And I don't think there are any easy answers.
No.
But I do think it's important for all of us to be asking these questions.
I agree. And, even within that just war framework, there are different interpretations of what last resort actually means.
Okay.
Some people say you have to exhaust every single peaceful option, even if it seems like it's not going to work.
Right.
And others say there's a point where negotiation just becomes pointless.
Right. It's like you're just delaying the inevitable.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so even people who agree on the idea of a just war might disagree on whether or not this war met that threshold.
Right. So there's no easy answer here.
There isn't. And I think for our listeners, it's important to acknowledge that we're not going to wrap this up with a neat little bow and tell you who was right and who was wrong.
We can't do that.
Yeah, this is messy, complicated stuff.
It is. What we're trying to do is encourage you to really think critically about this.
Yeah.
Question your assumptions.
Yeah.
And engage in these really difficult conversations about these complex issues.
Okay, so speaking of complexity, I want to shift our focus back to Ukraine.
Okay.
Because you mentioned earlier that there were these internal debates within Ukraine about the best course of action.
There were.
Even after Bucha.
Yeah.
So can you talk a bit more about that?
Well, it's really important to remember that Ukraine is a diverse country with lots of different political viewpoints.
Of course.
And while the majority of Ukrainians supported resisting the invasion, there were probably some who felt that a negotiated settlement was the best way to go.
Even after Bucha?
Even after Bucha.
Wow, okay.
It's a tough thing to imagine.
Yeah.
But, you know, put yourself in their shoes. I mean, their country was being attacked.
Yeah.
People were dying.
Yeah.
And they had to make these incredibly difficult decisions.
So what were the arguments that those who were advocating for peace were making?
Well, some might have argued that continuing the war would just lead to more death and destruction.
Yeah.
You know, maybe even the collapse of the Ukrainian state.
It makes sense.
They might have believed that a negotiated settlement, even if it meant making painful concessions, was the best way to protect Ukraine's sovereignty in the long run.
Okay, that's one perspective. What about those who wanted to keep fighting? What were their main concerns?
Well, they might have felt that negotiating with Putin was basically appeasement.
Right.
That it would just embolden him and lead to more aggression down the line. They might have also worried that any peace deal made under those circumstances would be inherently unfair and that it wouldn't last.
Okay, so you have these two very different viewpoints within Ukraine.
You do.
Those who saw negotiation as the best way to minimize the bloodshed, and those who felt that fighting on was the only way to really secure their freedom.
Exactly. And, you know, all of this was happening with Russia putting pressure on them and the West putting pressure on them.
So it was this incredibly difficult situation for Ukrainian leaders.
It was. They were trying to balance the needs of their own people with the demands of their allies and the threats from their enemy.
It's a lot to juggle.
It is. And, you know, it's easy to forget that there are real people behind these geopolitical events.
Right.
You know, stories of courage and sacrifice.
Yeah.
But also, you know, stories of fear and doubt and despair.
Yeah. It's easy to get lost in the abstract analysis and forget about the human cost. It's exactly
the millions who have been displaced, the families torn apart, the lives lost, the future's shattered.
It's heartbreaking.
It is. And it's hard to even process all of that.
It is.
And I think it's okay to feel overwhelmed.
It's okay.
By what's happening.
Absolutely.
To feel, you know, heartbroken.
Yeah.
But it's important to, you know, to find ways to cope with those feelings.
Right. Stay informed, but don't let the news consume.
Right.
You connect with people who share your concerns and, you know, support those organizations that are trying to help.
Yeah, that's good advice. And, you know, it's a good reminder that even in the midst of all this suffering, there's still hope.
There is
hope for a peaceful resolution, hope for a future where these kinds of conflicts can be prevented, and hope for a world where human life is truly valued.
I love that. That's a powerful thought to hold on to, you know, as we try to make sense of this situation.
Yeah.
But I also think it's important to acknowledge that even if the war ended tomorrow,
the scars of this conflict are going to be felt for a very long time.
That's true.
The trauma of war doesn't just go away overnight.
No. It takes a lot of time and effort to heal from something like this.
It does. And it takes a real commitment from the international community to support Ukraine in its efforts to rebuild and recover.
Right.
And it also takes a willingness to address the root causes of the conflict.
Exactly.
And work towards a more just and peaceful world.
Okay, so as we start to wrap up this deep dive, I think it's important to keep the bigger picture in mind.
Yeah.
You know, we've talked about the possibility of a missed opportunity for peace early on in the war.
Yeah.
We've looked at Russia, we've looked at the U.S., and we've also delved into those internal debates within Ukraine.
And we've talked about the human cost of all of this.
Exactly.
And the need for compassion and understanding and a commitment to peace.
But even with all of this information, we still haven't answered that fundamental question.
Right.
Could this war have ended sooner?
And that's a question that's going to continue to be debated for years to come.
Yeah.
And it's a question that I think each of you listening needs to grapple with.
Right.
On your own terms.
Based on what we've talked about.
On the evidence we've presented.
Yeah.
And your own understanding of this very complex situation.
Absolutely.
And as we try to answer that question, it's also important to think about what we can learn from all of this.
Right. What are the takeaways here?
Yeah.
What can we do as individuals, as a global community?
As a planet. To prevent these kinds of conflicts
from happening again.
From happening in the future.
And that's a question that I think we're going to explore further in the final part of this deep dive.
In part 3.
Yeah, so stay tuned for that.
But for now, I want to leave you with this thought. Even in the midst of all this chaos and despair, there's always a glimmer of hope.
Yeah.
Hope for peace, hope for justice, hope for a better future.
Yeah, and that's a good point to bring up because, we've been talking about what could have happened, but the reality is this war is still going on.
Right.
So, does any of this historical analysis, does it even matter at this point?
I think it matters now more than ever. I mean, understanding how we got to this point can help us figure out how to move forward.
Right.
And it raises a question that I think is really important for everyone listening to consider. Is it too late for diplomacy?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I mean, on the one hand, we're seeing these horrific images from Ukraine every day.
Yeah.
The death, the destruction, the suffering.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, there's this part of me that wonders, could there still be a way out?
It's easy to get caught up in all the negativity and feel like there's no hope.
Yeah.
But, throughout history, even in the darkest of times, there have always been people who refused to give up on peace.
That's true.
Yeah.
It's easy to get cynical,
Yeah.
But there are people out there working behind the scenes.
There are.
Trying to find a way forward.
They're trying to build bridges to open up those lines of communication, to find some kind of common ground.
And their work is so important.
It is.
Even if it doesn't always get the attention it deserves.
Absolutely. And I think it's something that we all need to support.
Right.
Because peace isn't just something that happens.
Right.
It's something that we have to work for.
Yeah, we have to actively create it.
We have to be willing to engage with people we disagree with, to listen to different perspectives and try to find solutions that work for everyone.
I was thinking about something you said earlier about the scars of this conflict and how they're going to last for generations. And it really made me think about the long-term impact of war.
Yeah.
Not just on, buildings and infrastructure, but on the people who have lived through it.
Absolutely. The trauma of war doesn't just disappear when the fighting stops.
It doesn't.
It can manifest in so many different ways.
Yeah.
PTSD, depression, anxiety,
yeah,
broken families, communities that are torn apart.
And that's why peace is about so much more than just, ending the violence.
It is.
It's about rebuilding lives, restoring trust.
Right.
And addressing the root causes of the conflict.
And that's where I think we all have a role to play.
Yeah.
As citizens, we have a responsibility to hold our leaders accountable.
Right.
To demand that they prioritize diplomacy.
Yeah.
To support those organizations that are working to heal the wounds of war.
That's a good point. It's easy to feel helpless.
Yeah.
When you see something like this happening on the other side of the world.
It is.
But we can make a difference.
We can.
Even small actions can have an impact.
Right. Staying informed, having these conversations, supporting humanitarian efforts, speaking out for peace.
All of those things matter.
They all matter. So we started this deep dive by asking whether the war in Ukraine could have ended sooner.
Right.
And we might never have a definitive answer to that question.
Right. But I think we've uncovered something even more important.
I agree.
We've gained a deeper understanding of the complexities of war and peace.
The choices that are made.
Yeah, and the consequences of those choices.
And I think the biggest takeaway for me is this. Peace is fragile.
It is.
It takes work to maintain it.
It does.
It takes a willingness to compromise and to keep talking, even when it's hard.
Even when it seems impossible.
Exactly.
Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
Yeah, thanks for listening.
We hope this conversation has challenged you to think critically.
And to keep asking those tough questions.
About this ongoing conflict.
And don't let the conversation end here.
Right. Keep learning, stay engaged.
Yeah.
And never give up hope for a more peaceful world.
Absolutely.